Hello again everyone, and welcome back. It's been a little while. Before we get into why that is, and also what we're going to be doing today, I want to start by reaching out with some questions for you guys. Most of my viewership is actually made up of people who are more experienced in building guitars than myself, and as you may or may not know, depending on where you watch these videos, I quite often post them on Facebook forums and also on other internet forums designed for luthiers to request information and advice on how I'm going to build this, because this is my first guitar. I'm reaching probably the most complicated aspect of my build soon, which is the inlays. And in typical fashion for this build, despite it being my first build, instead of sensibly keeping it nice and simple, I've decided to go all out and do something quite complex. Please don't try and put me off doing the complicated thing. I know I could make it a lot easier for myself, but as I've said before, the whole idea of this build is to explore the art of the possible. I don't really see the point in kind of putting off doing something more complicated until further down the line, only to mess it up then. I figure I might as well get my mistakes out of the way early on and learn to do things properly. After all, this is my first build, and I know that, you know, once I'm sort of 10 guitars down the line, I'm going to build something I'm a lot happier with in terms of something I'd like to play every day. So I really want this guitar to be something a little bit quirky, a little bit different, something that might look good hanging on a wall. So with that in mind, brace yourself, here's what I've got planned. So this is a Photoshop mock-up of the rough idea of what I want the inlays to look like, and as most of you have probably guessed, it's based on Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon album cover. I am a big fan of Pink Floyd, and I'm also a big fan of Stone Thorgerson, the guy who actually produced most of their album covers, or at least their most famous ones. And I really like the motif in itself, not even because it's anything particularly to do with Pink Floyd. I've seen the heartbeat motifs done on a fretboard before, and I think they look really cool. So I think this would be a really good thing to take a step further. The problem is though, I need to figure out how I'm actually going to do this, and there are several problems. So what I'm hoping is that some of the guys out there who have a little bit of experience in inlay might have some ideas about how I can break this down into manageable sections and how I'm basically going to attack this. You might be aware of some materials and techniques that I'm not. If you do have a YouTube account, I would appreciate it if you could leave the comments below the video, just because I'll find it easier to come back and comment on them in the future. But if you are watching this video on Facebook or anything like this, by all means do leave a comment or send me a direct message and let me know what you think. Your advice really is appreciated at this stage. So without any further ado, let's actually have a look at what I've got to work with so far. So I want to focus on the neck first. This is the fretboard as it currently stands. It's worth noting that I've already glued it to the neck blank. The neck blank has not yet been carved on the back, but I have slotted and radiused the fretboard already. Someone in a previous video did comment that traditionally you would probably do inlays before radiusing the fretboard. I am aware of that technique, particularly when you're talking about thick abalone and all that kind of stuff. But to be honest with you, in my mind, I'd envisaged using sheet materials like veneer or even sheet metal that's quite thin but also bends. Therefore, I didn't see the harm in, when I route out the inlay cavities, that they actually have a curved bottom that kind of matches the radius of the fretboard, because in theory, if I'm using all sheet materials, then that should actually work out quite nicely without me having to really sand away at the inlay material much, if at all. So if we look at the design, the top half of the fretboard is effectively a silver line, and it has a little heartbeat every so far along. The idea being that the heartbeat would obviously be on the 3rd fret, the 5th fret, and all the places you would normally have your fret markers. Now, in my head, the plan had been, and still is, I think, that I've got some tin plated steel, which is like a really thin, pliable metal, that will bend and stay in whatever shape that you bend it to. It can also be cut with tin snips. It's quite easy to work with. I could file it away. It will bend a little bit probably if I try and file it. But what I'd basically intended to do was draw out the design, use a chisel to just mark out the straight lines in the design, and then effectively use a router with a precision base, i.e. my Dremel, and just basically carve out that entire section, and then by hand try and cut and manipulate the metal to fill that in. Now there are other options available. The fact that the fretboard's already cut and radiused makes it a little bit more tricky, but I could, for example, maybe use some kind of resin, or I know people like Crimson do those metal flakes that you can sort of mix with resin and fill it in. That would be an option, but I think the glittery aspect of it would be a little bit too much. I think I'd much rather prefer just a clean sheet of nice shiny metal. The concern I did have was, one, would glue adhere to that metal okay? I think if it was nice snugly fitting, then super glue should hold it in okay. But also, me personally, I'm one of these people who I've got quite corrosive sweat when it comes to using strings and things like that. All of the hardware on my guitar always goes rusty and that kind of thing. So I am slightly worried that if I use any kind of metal on the fretboard, ultimately it's going to tarnish over time, which is just the way things go. But I don't know if there's a way I could avoid that, or whether that would be acceptable. I'd like to know people's thoughts on that. Also, the technique that I've just described, do you think that's a good idea? I could make templates and things, but I think it would be more trouble than it's worth. Maybe a little template for the heartbeat shape might be handy, but I don't know. What do you think? So that's that end of the fretboard. Once we get down to the 12th fret marker, there's going to be the prism that the light refracts through. Now, again, I think that's going to be fairly simple. I think the triangular shape, again, I'll probably either just use a chisel because it's like a flat-sided shape, and scoop that out into a triangular shape. I might even just do that with a flat bottom using the chisel, and then it'll be a question of, well, I could use Perspex, but I'm quite tempted to try and get hold of some quartz or some other, like, you know, you get these geode type materials. You can get them in thin slices which have a kind of gradient pattern in them. I was thinking about buying something like that and actually trying to cut it into a triangle in such a way that it fades much in the same way as the triangle does on the actual album cover or some of the record labels if you have a look at it. Thinking about it, if I was going to use my router to route it out and I ended up with that curved bottom or the radius on the bottom of the inlay pocket, then I would probably have to sand the back of that quartz or whatever it was to put that radius in the back of it. Whereas if I did it with a chisel, I would probably end up with a flat bottom on the back of it, so that might be an easier way to go with that. But again, I think that's probably actually going to be the easiest part of it, as long as I don't shatter whatever it is that I'm going to put in there. The really tricky bit is when we move down to the bottom of the fretboard, where we've ultimately got multiple coloured stripes. That's the bit that I'm really not sure about, particularly as well when you consider that, oh, birds in the background there, particularly when you consider that I'm going to extend that coloured stripe onto the body. So initially, well, let me show you. Initially, I thought about taking these maple banding strips and effectively stacking several of them up side by side, dyeing them different colours to make the different coloured lines. That itself presents some problems in that obviously we need lots of colours with distinct lines glued together. So it becomes that question of, well, do I maybe soak them in dye to colour the strips individually, then glue them together, and then risk that when I maybe sand them down, I kind of end up taking the dyed wood off the top and sort of having to re-dye them? Or do I just glue them all together and then very gently paint the lines on? Or that was one way I was thinking about going at it, but the main problem I actually see with that is these banding strips. I think they're, off the top of my head, they might be 2-3 mil thick, something like that. They're going to look way too thick when I put them on the neck. I mean, realistically, that multicoloured stripe, if I get a few more strips, let's see, there's 2 strips. It's already starting to look quite thick. I've got 4 of these. Let's see what 4 of them look like together. Yeah, so about 4 strips there together. That's probably about the maximum thickness that I'd want that line to be. Whereas if we look at the Pink Floyd design, it has 6 distinct colours. We've got 4 there. If we made that into 6, I think it would look a bit too thick. I don't know if I've got any other little bits of banding there I could mock that up with. Hang on a second. Here's 2 little scraps that I was experimenting with to see how dyes would take with it. So I've got 2 bits in the middle there. I don't know if you can see them, that I've dyed black. That would be the overall thickness if I used 6 banding strips. Now the question is, would that be too thick? You know, as I actually stand and look at it there mocked up, I think 6 of those strips might be okay. I mean, that's 5. Yeah, that would be 6. Yeah, so I don't know, now I stand and look at it there, if I'll put the camera directly above, maybe 6 isn't too thick. I thought it might be, but what do you think? That could actually work. If I was going to go down that route, which I'm more than happy to, yeah, it only becomes a question of, well, how do I go about dyeing them best? That's going to allow me to A, not have the colours bleed into each other, and also B, allow me to sand them back so that they're nice and flush with the fretboard. Your questions and comments below on that one, please. But also remember that in this design we have the green line running through the middle, which actually also has the heartbeat in it. Now, what I planned for that, well, I wasn't sure. My intent, I think, is to do all of the other coloured stripes first and leave a black stripe up the middle, and then take the router and actually carve out the green stripe or with the heartbeat motifs, and actually fill that with some kind of green resin or something of that nature. I mean, I could use a sheet material like some kind of plastic, celluloid, something like that. I'm not really sure what I would find in that kind of pale minty green colour that would actually be appropriate. Again, I would like your input on that. What way do you think is best to go about it? And then, keeping those thoughts in your head, if I extend this strip in much the same way onto the body, I have to go through the whole finishing process on the body. So that body has to be sanded back, it has to be probably not sealed, maybe sealed, and then dyed black. Now again, I have that problem as well. Do I dye it black first, then route the channel, then put the inlays in? Or do I route the channel first, then dye it, then put the inlays in? There's a number of ways I could go about it, and it all really becomes about, if it's all about dyeing wood, how do I stop those colours bleeding into each other? In my head, if I use glue in between all of the different colour strips and make sure that there's a healthy proportion of glue in between those strips, it should form some kind of like anti-seep barrier that should stop the colour seeping from one strip into the other, provided that there's a consistent line of glue. And I think if I really had to, I could go along those strips with a fine paintbrush and just touch them up after sanding if I needed to. But I'm also not sure about, well, if I have to start sanding over all these strips after they've been dyed, would I get lots of colour bleed from the dust of one colour going into the other? It's not something I really have experience with. Okay, so I think I've rambled about that enough. That is my question, and that is what I would like feedback on. You've seen my design. How would you go about it? Your answers below would be very much appreciated. So with that out of the way, I've been offline for a little while. That's because we've had the Christmas period. I've also had a lot to get on with in my home. I decided to rip the living room apart about 2 weeks before Christmas and try and get it redecorated and all the furniture and everything replaced before Christmas, so that pretty much took up all my time. Frank and I have been down the garage doing some work down there. We've put in some strip lighting, which I think I've got a photo of I can put on screen now. As you can see, we put in some LED strip lights there, which mean it should be fine for filming down there and just a little bit more pleasant to work down there going forward. Also, not on the photo, we've actually put in a load of electrical sockets. Everything in there is pretty much ready to go electric wise, but we want to get it finally checked off and wired into the mains by a registered electrician, which is just taking a little bit of time to get sorted, but that's nearly there. As soon as we've got the electric down there, I can move the machines from here down there and we should be good to go, which means hopefully I'll be able to get on with things a little bit quicker than I have been doing so far. So yeah, that's what's going on with the garage. So there shouldn't be too many more videos coming from the shed really. Watch this space. But yeah, lastly, I took a week off work to get on with the build a little bit more, and as Sod's Law would dictate, on the Sunday night, I came down with horrendous man flu, which I'm still recovering from, and it's now Thursday night and I'm busy all weekend, so chances are I'm not really going to get anything done this week at all. I just really wanted to get a video out there to catch up with you guys. That said, I am going to try and get a little bit of something done today. I have already just spent a little bit of time tidying up and clearing up some of the mess in here since we haven't managed to move out yet. There's two jobs. One I've already been talking about is getting the neck ready to be inlaid. Before I can do that, I am actually going to have to route the sides of the fretboard and put some banding on. Not really through stylistic choice, just more so from the fact that unfortunately when I put the fretboard on the blank wasn't exactly flat, and I ended up having to radius the fretboard flat to compensate for it, and when I've compensated, it looks like the edge of the fretboard is actually really thin. Just remember the camera's probably not on autofocus, is it? Yeah, on one side of the fretboard, I don't know if you can see there, the edge of it looks like it tapers away really thin, but it's not actually the fretboard doing that, it's the neck coming up because it's not perfectly flat. So I mean, you know, that's not the end of the world, but it doesn't look great, so I think it'd be a good idea to just put some banding along the edges just to disguise that a little bit, which is a common trick. The only problem with that is normally if you're going to route for the banding, you would normally do it face down on the table, and you would do it before radiusing the fretboard, because as it stands at the moment, if I put the fretboard down, it could rock from side to side, and that's going to cause all kind of issues with the routing. Also, the edge of this neck blank, thankfully I haven't carved it yet, it is still a flat surface, but it's quite rough. It's quite chunky. So what I want to try and do, there's actually two ways I could go about this. I could either sand and fill the edge of that to make it nice and smooth, so that the guided bearing cutter can use it as a guide a lot more smoothly, and that should give us a much smoother binding channel. Or I could actually take a piece of banding or something like that and actually just temporarily stick it on the side there and effectively use that as the guide for my bearing, which isn't a bad idea at all. Either way, I'm not going to get to do the routing today, but I thought just as a little tidy up job, it might be a good idea to just take some sandpaper to that. And I'm quite curious to see if this filler gel that I've been using, normally you would mix that with dust and glue and it makes a really good alternative to dust and glue as a filler. I'm curious to see what happens if I just actually slap some of that on the side of that board as almost a kind of a grain filler. I expect it will leave some visible white residue if it's quite thick, but I thought I could maybe slap some of that on and sand it back just to see if that gives me a smoother surface, because I'm just actually curious to see how it behaves. So that's the neck, and then also the other job, which is sort of next on the horizon, is the body itself. We still need to finish off the neck pocket. Now I'm probably not going to have in fact I'm definitely not going to have a chance to get round to that today. Today's really more just about taking stock of where I was, because it's been a couple of months almost since I worked on this. But one thing I am going to need in order to continue to route that out is effectively a dummy bridge. I think we've talked before about setting the neck angle actually in the neck pocket, and to do that I need to rest the template on the body but at the angle, the break angle that the neck needs to have. So I need a little dummy block to represent the bridge to go on there as well. So that's something I could possibly get around to today as well. So but let's start by just taking a look at the neck. So nothing exciting about this at all really. I'm just going to take a flat block of wood, some medium grit sandpaper, and just go up and down the edge of here first of all to clean it up a little bit. There we go, and same on the other side. Go, that feels nice and smooth. So we just need a little brush, and I'm just going to try applying some of that filler gel along the edge here, and I'm hoping that it may just fill out some of the little imperfections. I mean, bear in mind this neck has not yet been carved, so I don't need it to be a perfectly smooth finish yet. All I'm hoping is that I can just take out some of the little divots and little peaks in this finish. That means that the bearing is going to get a much smoother surface to guide it along when we cut that binding channel, because any little variances or little wiggles in the binding will probably be quite apparent if we translate them from the side onto the front of the fretboard, so we don't want that to happen. So I'm just going to take some of that filler gel and brush it on the edge quite liberally, get in all the cracks. not sure what this stuff is made out of, but the smell of it certainly reminds me of the old poly cement you used to get to do airfix kits and things with. I'm hoping, as I say, that it will go somewhere, not to fully fill up any of the little dents, but just to take the edge off them, if you like, as I say, just so that bearing can get along there a little bit smoother. It might hopefully as well help prevent tear out, because I am more than likely, in fact definitely, going to be cutting down into the palm wood, which, as we know, does tear out quite badly. So hopefully with some of this stuff applied, it might kind of serve to solidify and glue it together a little bit. I'm finding the wood quite absorbent, soaking that stuff up. There is a bit of a danger here that, because I have seen when this stuff dries, it does, if it's too thick, it can dry white, which obviously would show up on this. But I'm hoping that, given I haven't carved the neck yet, it should sand back just fine, especially when finish is applied to it. I think it should look fine. So I'm now going to do the other side, and then I'll let it dry and then sand it back again. It's not going to have a great effect, to be honest. I'm just, as I say, quite curious to see how this filler stuff reacts, or how it behaves when it's just applied neat, should I say. Quite like this masking tape, by the way. Pro Deck Advance, the tape's called. I think it came from Tool Station. It's a good painter's tape, I would call it. Yep, you are sat on YouTube now, quite literally watching paint dry, almost. Maybe we should get out more, I don't know. Please don't. Please stay and watch the channel. And like and subscribe and share and all that stuff. Incidentally, you know, if you do find any bits of these videos boring, do let me know, because I do try and edit them and cut them so that they're not too boring. I try and show a little of as little sanding and stuff like this as possible, really, because it's not the most exciting stuff in the world. What we like is power tools and danger and limbs getting chopped off. But as I say, just a slow day today. So I can already see that that's drying pretty quickly on the other side there, and it has got a little bit of a whitish sheen to it almost, but I'm going to set it off to one side to dry for the moment, and we'll have a little bit of a think about that dummy bridge. Alright, so let's talk bridges. This is the bridge I will be using, which I've not used before on any of my guitars, but seems really good value for money. It's a Wilkinson all-in-one wraparound bridge, and it's fully adjustable on every saddle. I can't remember how much it cost, but it was not a lot of money at all. Now, I don't have the specs to hand, but quick measure with a ruler says to me that that bridge up to the saddle is roughly about 15mm. By the time you add in the extra little bit of thickness at the post side, we're talking somewhere in the region of about 16-17mm. Yeah, about 17mm fully screwed down that bridge. Just so happens I picked up this random scrap of wood and that random scrap of wood is 17mm thick. So if I put that in position where the bridge is going to be and put anything resting on that, that should very roughly be my ideal neck break angle. So I think I mentioned in a previous video, if I can find where I've stashed the template, there we go. If I were to then put my neck routing template on top of that and then route out the neck pocket, that should mean that I then copy the neck break angle into the router pocket itself. It should be positioned more like that, but you get the idea. So if I masking tape and super glue that in place, then that should be my neck break angle more or less sorted. The only thing I then need to do is determine how deep I actually need the neck pocket to be, and I think I've already mentioned that's not an exact science at this point. If I take my neck blank, which you can see is drying, a sort of patchy white colour, and I fit that in there, at the moment it's roughly about half the depth it needs to be. I want to see the body as it is at the moment pretty much right up to the bottom of the fretboard, because I then want to actually carve the body away a little bit to allow a little bit better access to the fretboard. But if I shoot for getting that sunk in there pretty much up to the bottom of the fretboard at the moment, I think it should sit about right. So in theory, I need the pocket to be roughly about 2 centimeters deeper than it currently is. Now I've used excessive amounts of super glue on that because, as I say, the surface wasn't particularly flat, so I wanted to give it a chance to sort of fill out the gap a little bit. So I'm going to leave that to dry for a little bit despite using the accelerator, and then that should be good to go. Meanwhile, let's go back to the neck. That filler has now dried. It dries pretty quickly, and as I mentioned, in some places the film has got, well, it's white basically, which I'm not too concerned about. Just going to quickly run over that with some sandpaper. So there we have it, and after a little experiment you can see, as I suspected, that we've got white patches where the filler is dried quite thick, and I suspect that's why it actually does so well when it's mixed with dust, because normally when you mix dust and glue it ends up quite dark, and I think this gel filler is actually quite light, if anything too light, and when it's mixed with the dust it kind of counteracts that effect that you normally get with the dust and glue where it ends up darker. But not to worry, I'm hoping it'll all come right in the end with correct sanding and correct filler used on it. But it has highlighted where I've previously filled in with dust and glue on this neck where I've had tear out and things, and it's really kind of bringing to light the challenge of working with the palm wood. The palm wood, even as it is now, I mean, I can feel along there's little divots and dents and all sorts in that neck blank. Not along the edge so much, where I've done my best to kind of fill it in ready to route it, but it's not a smooth and even wood to work with. I'm really hoping that with careful sanding and careful shaping I can shape a neck out of it and just go really gentle sanding it down and get to the point where I've got a usable neck. I don't think it's going to be perfectly smooth on its own even with that, and I am going to have to come up with some method of being able to fill it which doesn't look too horrendous. I can get a kind of dyed grain filler, something like you would normally use on the back of a traditional Les Paul, and it will probably serve somewhere to help that, but what it will do is probably lose a lot of the natural variation in colour that you get between the dark and the light spots, which I really don't want to do. So I'm a bit of a loss is what I'm going to do there. I mean, it may well end up that once I've got the neck carved, I may just have to either accept that it's going to be a very rough and imperfect neck, or I might have to do something quite drastic in terms of effectively filling it and then painting it. I don't know. But we did say from the outset when we chose to work with palm wood that that is a challenge that we're going to have, and if anything's going to go wrong or be unrecoverable about this guitar, it is going to be using this wood on the neck. But not to worry, I'm still going to proceed as planned in routing out the edge of that neck, ready for banding, and we'll get it bound. And then we'll probably actually look to carve the neck before doing the inlay, because I don't think I want to go so far as gluing the neck in, doing all the inlay, then come to carve the neck of the guitar and find it's a complete loss. So that will be the way we go. You know, if it doesn't work out, then I mean, we could always make another neck. I haven't glued it in at this point, but I would like to salvage what I can of this. I think it's still going to be usable. It's just what finish we're going to end up with in the end, really. So there we have it. As you can see, that filler is not going to be suitable for doing any filling just neat by itself when it's not mixed with dust, because it is drying kind of white, so that's not going to be any good. I've said right from the outset that working with this palm wood is going to be an absolute nightmare. I intend to carve the neck more or less by sanding entirely, just to try and avoid tear out as much as possible. I'm hoping that I can get down to the point where I've got a nice carved usable neck that requires as little filling as possible. It's going to be unavoidable that there are some tiny little spots on this neck that need to be filled. If they're small enough, I should be able to get away with dust and glue, and it's just going to be a little spot that you're going to see if you look really closely on the guitar. I have had to bear in mind that if that all goes horribly wrong, then I could end up just entirely making another neck, or effectively just filling it and painting over it and kind of sacrificing the visual appeal of the palm wood that we've been shooting for. Who knows? If anyone's got any ideas, any comments, any ideas on what is probably going to be a good material to fill the wood with, then I'd love to hear from you. I mean, I'm thinking that any kind of clear drying resin might be a good way to go, but how you can go about applying that on a neck in such a way that it's not just going to run off the neck and will actually fill the gaps could be quite tricky, but it's something we could do. Again, if anyone's got any experience of that, I'd love to hear from you. Next time we will probably go back to looking at the neck pocket. I really want to get that neck pocket finished, get the body more or less ready to go. The only reason I haven't been doing that so far is because I've been hoping to get set up down at the garage with all the power tools and everything before I do any major cutting and shaping work, but we'll see how it goes. I just really wanted to catch up today, remind myself of where I was up to and see what challenges I had going forward, because it's been nearly 2 months or something since I worked on this. So yeah, so hopefully a little bit more exciting next time, but I'm looking forward to getting all your feedback. Until next time, guys, goodbye.